The Great Crusade had crossed regions of the galaxy that no human cartographer had ever named, but even the Emperor's fleet had learned to fear the unknown. Beyond the edge of charted space, the navigators detected something that should not have existed, a colossal warp anomaly stretching across the void like a wound in reality. Its currents twisted around themselves, hiding everything within from the Astronomicon and swallowing every attempt to penetrate it. Then, buried beyond the storm, the fleet detected human life. The Emperor ordered the advance. His vessels emerged from the anomaly above a world that appeared impossibly primitive. Vast continents were covered by forests, mountains, walled cities and armies moving across the plains. There were no orbital stations, no void craft, no great manufactoria. Yet the population was enormous. Humanity had survived here without the Imperium. The first Imperial landing forces expected little resistance. They were wrong. Across a blood-soaked valley, human warriors fought creatures that looked as though they had crawled directly from some nightmare of the warp. Men in crude armor charged with axes and hammers while enormous beasts tore through their ranks. Then one warrior entered the battle, and everything changed. He was young, broad-shouldered and impossibly strong. He seized a creature that outweighed him several times over and hurled it into the earth. Another beast charged. The warrior met it head-on, drove his weapon through its skull, and continued forward without hesitation. From the landing zone, the Space Marines watched. Behind them, the Emperor said nothing. His eyes remained fixed upon the warrior. The young man approached the Imperial delegation with blood upon his armor and a weapon still in his hand. He looked at the towering Astartes surrounding the golden figure before him, but he did not kneel. "Why have you come to my land?" The Emperor studied him in silence. Within moments, secret genetic samples had been taken and carried aboard the flagship. The results returned almost immediately. The scientists stared at the data in disbelief. The genetic pattern was impossible. It belonged to one of the Emperor's lost sons. He had found a Primarch. But before the truth could be spoken, the world screamed. The warp anomaly surrounding the planet erupted. Reality tore open above distant cities, and shapes with burning eyes began pouring into the sky. Imperial vessels vanished from Auspex screens one after another. The fleet attempted to withdraw, but the storm had changed. The Emperor ordered Sigmar evacuated. The attempt lasted seconds. Ships broke apart inside the anomaly. Others were dragged into impossible currents of warp energy. Even the Emperor's flagship struggled against forces that seemed determined to keep the planet sealed. There was no choice. The Emperor ordered the fleet to retreat. Sigmar stood upon a mountain ridge as the golden ships disappeared into the storm. He watched until the last light vanished. Far above him, aboard a vessel already slipping beyond the anomaly, the Emperor gave a final order. He would return for his son. But the storm swallowed the words. Sigmar never heard the promise. And the world beyond the storm was forgotten. 10,000 years after the Great Crusade had passed into the distant memory of mankind, the Imperium found the storm again. An exploration fleet traveling beyond the established Imperial routes detected a disturbance ahead that immediately brought the navigators to the edge of panic. It was not a normal warp current, nor did it behave like a conventional storm. The anomaly seemed to surround an enormous region of space, twisting the light of distant stars and bending the fleet's instruments into meaningless readings. One navigator reported seeing an entire world hidden behind it. Another insisted that the storm was moving around something rather than through space. Then the first navigator collapsed and gave the expedition commander a single piece of information: there was human life beyond the anomaly. The fleet entered. For those aboard the Imperial vessels, the journey became a nightmare of distorted time and impossible sensations. Ships disappeared from formation and returned minutes later, their crews insisting they had been gone for days. Vox channels carried voices from vessels that could no longer be detected. Navigators struggled to maintain a course as the warp seemed to twist around the fleet, pulling each ship toward a different destination. Several vessels were lost before the flagship finally emerged from the other side. A planet hung beneath them. It was unmistakably human. Vast oceans covered its surface, enormous forests stretched across continents, and mountain ranges divided territories filled with settlements. Auspex systems began measuring population centers, and the numbers continued climbing until the bridge officers stopped speaking. Billions of human beings lived below them. Yet there were no orbital stations, no void ships, no satellite networks, and no great manufactoria. Instead, the planet was covered by immense stone cities, fortified castles, sprawling settlements, and armies moving across the countryside. It was as though an entire human civilization had been trapped in another age. The expedition commander classified it as a lost human colony. Imperial landers descended through the atmosphere, carrying soldiers, tech priests, scholars, and several squads of Adeptus Astartes. They expected primitive resistance at most. What they found waiting for them was an organized army. Thousands of human warriors stood across a wide valley beneath banners of unfamiliar design. They wore steel armor and carried swords, shields, spears, and primitive firearms. Mounted cavalry waited behind them while priests and officers shouted orders. The appearance of the Imperial landers had clearly frightened them, but they had not fled. Then the Space Marines stepped onto the ground. The reaction was immediate. The local warriors stared at the towering Astartes as if they had witnessed beings from their oldest legends. Some lowered their weapons. Others fell to their knees. A few began praying. The Marines were taller than any ordinary human, their armor covered in strange symbols, their weapons capable of killing with a single thunderous shot. To the locals, there was no explanation for such beings except the supernatural. The Imperial commanders ordered their troops to remain calm. The situation might have remained peaceful if the forest had not erupted behind the human army. Something enormous charged from the trees. It had the shape of a gigantic predator, but its body was twisted by unnatural proportions. Its jaws opened far too wide, and its hide was thick enough to turn aside several primitive weapons. The local soldiers broke formation as the creature tore through them. A Space Marine stepped forward. His bolter fired once. The beast vanished beneath the impact. The valley fell silent. The surviving warriors looked from the remains of the creature to the armored giant who had killed it. Whispers spread through their ranks, quickly repeated by frightened soldiers and priests. Silver giants. The Imperials continued inland. What they discovered over the following days was far more important than the local army. The planet contained ruins older than most of its surviving kingdoms. Entire structures had been buried beneath forests, mountains, and modern cities. Some had been deliberately sealed, while others had been built over so many times that their original purpose had been forgotten. Imperial scholars began excavating one such site beneath the ruins of an ancient fortress. The first symbols they uncovered were strange, but familiar enough to make the tech priests uneasy. They were not written in modern High Gothic, yet several characters resembled ancient Terran forms. The deeper the excavation went, the stronger the connection became. Then they found the archive. Inside were stone tablets, metal fragments, and ancient records protected from the passage of time. Most were damaged beyond recovery, but Imperial linguists managed to translate portions of the surviving text. One name appeared again and again. Sigmar. He was described as a king, a warrior, and the protector of mankind. Some records called him the greatest champion the world had ever known. Others described him as a divine figure who had united humanity against monsters and darkness. But there were older records. Records that spoke of a golden warrior descending from the heavens. A father who came from beyond the stars. A mysterious figure who offered Sigmar a place among the heavens. The Imperial historians read the passages again and again. The similarities were impossible to ignore. The Great Crusade had reached countless human worlds. The Emperor had searched the galaxy for his scattered sons. If the ancient records were telling even a fragment of the truth, then Sigmar might have been more than the founder of a forgotten civilization. He might have been connected to the greatest secret in Imperial history. Before the expedition could investigate further, the planet's rulers demanded contact. A large delegation approached the Imperial camp under banners and armored escorts. These were not frightened tribesmen. Their soldiers marched in disciplined formations, their officers carried themselves with confidence, and their leader spoke as a man accustomed to ruling millions. "We are the Empire of Man." The Imperial commander studied him carefully. There was only one Imperium of Man. Yet these people had built an empire of their own. They possessed kingdoms, armies, laws, and ancient traditions. They had survived without the protection of Terra for thousands of years. Their historians remembered wars against creatures the Imperium recognized as servants of chaos. Their priests spoke of gods. Their scholars spoke of ancient races. Their people worshipped a legendary figure named Sigmar. And their history had developed completely outside Imperial control. The commander realized that this was not simply a lost colony. It was a civilization that had been separated from mankind for so long that it had become something entirely its own. The two sides began negotiations, each suspicious of the other and neither willing to reveal everything it knew. The Imperials wanted access to the ancient archives. The Empire wanted to understand why strangers claiming to represent humanity had appeared from the heavens. Neither side knew that their arrival had already been noticed elsewhere. Far below the cities and forests, deeper than the oldest ruins, something had stirred. It had slept beneath the world for thousands of years, hidden beneath layers of stone and forgotten history. It had watched kingdoms rise and collapse. It had listened to the prayers of generations that had long since turned to dust. And it remembered. It remembered golden ships crossing the heavens. It remembered the arrival of the Emperor. It remembered the young warrior called Sigmar. Now, after 10,000 years, the same presence had returned. The ancient darkness opened its eyes. The Imperium had found the lost world. But it had also awakened something that had been waiting for its return. The Imperial delegation entered the capital 3 days after first contact, and even the most experienced officers found themselves unprepared for what waited beyond the city's walls. The capital stretched across an enormous valley, surrounded by fortifications that rose like mountains of stone. Towers crowded the skyline, banners hung from bridges and battlements, and roads carried an endless stream of people, merchants, soldiers, and nobles. The population was immense. Yet there was no industrial machinery, no towering manufactoria, and no sign of the familiar imperial architecture. It was a human civilization that had grown according to its own history. As the imperial vehicles moved through the streets, thousands of people stopped to watch them. Children pointed at the armored transports while soldiers stared suspiciously at the space marines riding inside. The sight of the Astartes caused a mixture of fear and fascination, but the reaction to the imperial technology was almost as strong. Locals crowded around the machines, whispering about weapons that fired without powder and engines that moved without horses. The Imperials, meanwhile, watched the people around them with equal curiosity. Every street seemed to reveal another fragment of a forgotten human culture. Blacksmiths worked beside gun makers. Armored knights rode through crowds of civilians. Priests carried symbols of gods unknown to the Imperium. Above them all stood enormous statues of Sigmar. The delegation was eventually led into the imperial palace, where the rulers of the empire had gathered. The meeting was tense from the beginning. The emperor of this world was not a single ruler but the distant figure represented by a council of nobles, generals, and religious authorities, all demanding to know why an armed force from the heavens had entered their territory. The imperial commander explained that the visitors came from an interstellar human civilization called the Imperium of Man, an empire that stretched across millions of worlds. The room erupted in disbelief. Several nobles laughed openly. Others accused the Imperials of inventing some elaborate deception. One elderly priest simply stared at the commander as though he had heard a story from a child's book. You claim Terra still exists? The Imperial historian answered. It does. The priest shook his head. Impossible. To the people of this world, Terra was not a living planet inhabited by billions of humans. It was a place from the oldest legends, a distant ancestral world spoken of in fragments and half-remembered prayers. Some ancient texts called it the birthplace of mankind. Others claimed it had been destroyed before the age of Sigmar. The idea that Terra still existed, and that an empire descended from it ruled across the stars, challenged the foundations of their history. The Imperial scholars began presenting evidence. Maps of the galaxy were displayed. Images of Terra appeared on screens. Records from the Great Crusade were translated and projected before the assembled rulers. The room gradually fell silent as the evidence became impossible to dismiss. Then, beneath the oldest temple in the capital, the locals produced something that silenced the Imperials in return. An ancient stone chamber had been uncovered during the preparations for the meeting. At its center lay a symbol carved into black stone. The Aquila. The Imperial officers immediately recognized it. The local priests did as well, though they understood it differently. They had seen the symbol in ancient manuscripts but had never known its meaning. Some believed it represented a forgotten god. Others claimed it was connected to the Golden Father who had appeared in Sigmar's earliest legends. The discovery changed the atmosphere of the entire palace. The Sigmarite priests demanded to know why the Imperium carried the same symbol. Imperial missionaries responded by explaining the Imperial Creed and the Emperor's role as the immortal ruler and protector of mankind. Their explanation was met with hostility. The Sigmarites had spent thousands of years building their faith around Sigmar. They would not simply accept that their god-king had been a servant of another being. The disagreement quickly became political. The Imperials saw Sigmar as a historical figure whose importance needed to be investigated. The priests saw him as the foundation of their civilization. To suggest that Sigmar had been merely a man, even an extraordinary one, was to challenge the legitimacy of the empire itself. The Imperial commander wisely ended the discussion before it became an argument neither side could control. While diplomats continued their negotiations, Imperial officers began studying the empire's military. What they discovered was unexpectedly formidable. The planet's technology was primitive compared with Imperial standards, but its armies were enormous and highly organized. Regiments of infantry carried black powder firearms. Artillery batteries protected fortified cities. Cavalry formations could cross entire regions in days, and elite warriors carried weapons enhanced by what the locals called magic. Imperial psychers soon confirmed that the phenomenon was not entirely imaginary. The warp was present everywhere. It flowed through the world in strange currents, concentrated around ancient ruins, forests, and battlefields. Certain individuals could manipulate it through rituals, spells, or what appeared to be inherited psychic abilities. The locals called these powers magic because that was the only language their civilization had developed to describe them. To the Imperium, the distinction was less comforting. They were looking at psychers. Perhaps something more. Imperial scholars began comparing the local legends with what they knew of the warp. The similarities were disturbing. The ancient records did not merely describe wars between kings and monsters. They described beings who offered power, armies that appeared from impossible realms, and voices that promised immortality. Again and again, one word appeared: chaos. The Imperials had known these enemies for 10,000 years. The people of this world had apparently been fighting them for just as long. That realization changed the expedition's understanding of the planet. This was not a civilization that had simply survived in isolation. It had survived against the same horrors that had threatened humanity across the galaxy, without space marines, without titans, and without the vast military machine of the Imperium. The commanders began asking themselves how. How had these people survived? How had their cities not fallen? How had their civilization endured thousands of years of contact with chaos? There were no easy answers. The meeting ended late in the evening. As the Imperial delegation prepared to leave, an elderly Sigmarite priest approached the commander. He had listened quietly throughout the negotiations, saying little while others argued. Now he looked toward the stars visible beyond the palace windows. "If your emperor truly came here once," he said, "then why did he never return?" The commander opened his mouth. Nothing came. The priest waited. The Imperial officers had records of countless campaigns, thousands of worlds conquered and civilizations absorbed into the Imperium. They possessed archives containing the deeds of the Emperor himself. But they had no record of this world. No record of Sigmar. No record explaining why the Emperor had left. For the first time since the expedition arrived, the Imperials were forced to confront the possibility that their own history was incomplete. And somewhere beneath the ancient city, the symbol of the Aquila remained buried beside records written during an age the Imperium had forgotten. The question of Sigmar became impossible to ignore. After the discovery beneath the temple, Imperial scholars were given access to several of the oldest Sigmarite sanctuaries in the capital. The priests resisted at first, but the political situation had become too delicate to prevent the investigation entirely. Imperial historians, linguists, and genetists entered chambers that had been sealed for centuries, comparing inscriptions with the fragments recovered from the ancient archive. Everywhere they looked, the same figure appeared. Sigmar was always depicted as a warrior, but the oldest paintings showed something that immediately caught the attention of the Imperials. He was enormous. His shoulders were far broader than those of ordinary humans, his limbs were proportioned differently, and even the artists who had surrounded him with other warriors had made the difference unmistakable. In several paintings, Sigmar stood almost twice the height of the men around him. An Imperial historian stared at one of the murals for a long time. "He doesn't look like a king." The geneticists understood what he meant. He looked like a Primarch. The thought was almost absurd. The Imperium had spent 10,000 years treating the lost Primarchs as one of the greatest mysteries of Imperial history. Their names had been erased, their records destroyed or sealed, and the surviving Primarchs had become figures of legend themselves. Yet here, on a forgotten world hidden behind a warp anomaly, a civilization had preserved the image of a warrior whose physical proportions resembled those of the Emperor's genetically engineered sons. The scholars needed evidence. They found it in an isolated monastery far from the capital. The monks claimed to possess one of Sigmar's oldest relics, a piece of ancient armor preserved within a sealed chamber. The Imperials expected another religious artifact. Instead, they found biological material embedded within the damaged metal. The relic was immediately placed under quarantine and transferred to the expedition's laboratories. Imperial scientists extracted microscopic samples while tech priests monitored every stage of the examination. Nobody spoke while the genetic analysis was performed. When the first results appeared, the laboratory became silent. The genetic structure was not merely unusual. It was familiar. The scientists compared it against archived Primarch data again and again, certain that some contamination had corrupted the results. It did not matter how many times they repeated the process. The markers were consistent with the genetic architecture associated with the Primarch project. The Emperor's work. The Emperor's sons. The impossible conclusion stood before them. Sigmar was not simply a powerful human. He had been created from the same genetic lineage as the Primarchs. The discovery was immediately classified. Every report was sealed. The scientists were ordered to speak to nobody outside the authorized command structure, and the relic was moved to the flagship under heavy guard. It was already too late. The priests knew. Nobody discovered who had leaked the information, but within hours the Sigmarite clergy were demanding answers. Their accusation spread through the capital. The Imperium had come to steal Sigmar's legacy. Some priests claimed the strangers wanted to take their god away. Others accused the Imperial delegation of hiding the truth about the ancient Golden Father. Tensions rose quickly. Imperial soldiers were deployed around the laboratories. Local warriors gathered outside the gates. For a moment, the two sides stood facing one another with weapons ready, separated only by a few meters of empty street. Then the first explosion came from the shadows. Chaos cultists emerged among the crowd. They attacked everyone. Men wearing Imperial uniforms were killed beside Sigmarite guards. Cultists carrying corrupted weapons fired into both forces while chanting prayers to powers that the locals had feared for generations. The confrontation between the Imperium and the Empire disappeared beneath a much greater threat. The Space Marines advanced. Local soldiers followed. For the first time, the two civilizations fought as allies. The cultists had expected confusion. Instead, they found themselves trapped between bolter fire and disciplined human warriors. Imperial weapons tore through their ranks while local knights and soldiers drove them from the streets. Then something far worse appeared. A sorcerer stepped through the flames. His body was covered in mutations, his armor twisted by chaos, and his eyes burned with unnatural light. He raised one hand and the air around him distorted. The Imperial Psykers immediately recognized the danger. Kill him. The attack struck before the sorcerer could complete his spell, but the Space Marines were forced back by a wall of warp energy. The sorcerer laughed as he looked upon the Imperial warriors. Then he saw the Aquila. His expression changed. You came. The Imperial commander stared at him. The sorcerer pointed toward the ancient city. After all these years, the Emperor's forgotten son has finally been found. The word struck harder than any weapon. The Imperials understood immediately. Chaos knew. The sorcerer smiled as though he had just revealed a secret that the Imperium had spent 10,000 years trying to bury. He began speaking Sigmar's name, calling him the forgotten son of the Emperor, but before the Imperial Psykers could seize him, a warp portal opened behind him. The Space Marines fired. The sorcerer disappeared. The portal collapsed. The battle ended soon afterward, leaving the streets filled with corpses belonging to both sides. Nobody celebrated the victory. The Imperials had learned something far more important than the identity of the cultists. Someone had known about Sigmar long before the expedition arrived. Imperial Command ordered a complete investigation of every surviving record. The oldest chronicles were brought out of the monasteries and translated under armed guard. Several contained damaged descriptions of an event that had been preserved in religious language for thousands of years. A golden warrior had descended from the heavens. He had spoken with Sigmar. He had offered him a place among the stars. And Sigmar had refused. The chronicles described the young warrior standing before his people, choosing his homeland over the distant heavens. They described him watching the Golden Fleet depart, believing that he had been abandoned. Then the records ended. The Imperial historians read the final surviving passage in silence. A Golden Fleet disappeared beyond the storm. The commander looked toward the ancient painting of Sigmar hanging above the archive chamber. For 10,000 years, the Imperium had searched for the lost sons of the Emperor. Now, on a world that had forgotten the Imperium but remembered its own history, they had found one. The Golden Warrior of the ancient chronicles had not been a god. He had been the Emperor. And Sigmar had been his son. The discovery that Sigmar had been connected to the Emperor changed the purpose of the Imperial expedition. What had begun as an exploration mission had become an investigation into a secret that appeared to have survived 10,000 years. If the Empire had preserved fragments of Sigmar's history, then the Imperials needed to know what other civilizations might remember. The oldest records pointed toward the Elven kingdoms, ancient realms that had existed long before the rise of the human empire. The journey north took the Imperial delegation through forests unlike anything they had previously encountered. The deeper they traveled, the stronger the warp disturbances became. Imperial Psykers reported strange sensations, as though something within the forest was watching them. Then the elves appeared. They did not announce themselves. They simply stood among the trees. Their weapons were already drawn, their faces calm and unreadable. The Imperial soldiers immediately raised their own weapons, but the elven seers showed no fear. They had sensed the Imperials long before the expedition reached their borders. "You carry something ancient," one of the seers said. The Imperial commander asked what she meant. "The blood of the Golden Age." The elven rulers refused the Imperium's initial demands for access to their archives. Their civilization had survived for ages before the human kingdoms appeared, and they had learned to protect their knowledge from outsiders. An Imperial officer warned them that refusal could have consequences. The Elven King simply smiled. "You have armies." He looked toward the Space Marine standing behind the delegation. "We have survived worse." The meeting continued inside the Elven Court, where the Imperials were surrounded by ancient architecture and artifacts that seemed almost untouched by time. The elves eventually admitted that their civilization had existed long before the Empire of Man and had witnessed the great catastrophe that shaped the world. They called it the Sundering. The Imperials recognized another name for it: a warp catastrophe. According to the Elven records, reality had once become dangerously unstable around the planet. Demons had crossed into the material world, entire regions had been corrupted, and ancient civilizations had nearly collapsed. It was during that age that Sigmar appeared. The elves had remembered him differently from the humans. They did not call him a god. They did not even call him a king. Their oldest records described him as something between both concepts: a warrior whose body and mind were beyond ordinary humanity, carrying knowledge that no man of the world should have possessed. Sigmar had fought beside the elves against chaos. He had understood their enemies. He had known things about the warp that their greatest seers struggled to comprehend. He had spoken of distant stars, worlds beyond the sky, and a civilization that stretched across the galaxy. The Imperial historians listened carefully. "Why did you never contact Terra?" one asked. The elven ruler gave him a strange look. "We could not." The answer was simple. The warp anomaly had isolated the world from the rest of humanity. Ships could not cross it reliably. Messages disappeared. Attempts to leave the planet ended in destruction or madness. Even the elves, with their ancient knowledge of the warp, had eventually accepted that the outside universe was unreachable. Then one of the oldest records was brought before the delegation. It was a painting. The Imperial officers stared at it. Sigmar stood in the center, younger than the figure depicted in later Imperial records, wearing armor unlike anything produced by the Empire. Beside him stood a golden warrior. The Emperor. There was no mistake. The Imperials had seen his image countless times. The face, the armor, and the presence were unmistakable. The elves had known. They had known for thousands of years that Sigmar was not merely a legendary human king. The Imperial commander demanded an explanation. An elderly seer stepped forward. Sigmar knew who the Golden Warrior was. The room became silent. He knew his father had come for him, she continued. He knew there was a place beyond this world where his blood belonged. The commander asked why Sigmar had remained. The seer looked toward the ancient painting. Because he chose his people. That answer was followed by a second revelation. Sigmar had waited for the Emperor to return. For years, perhaps decades, he had believed the Golden Fleet would come back through the storm. But the fleet never appeared. Eventually, Sigmar stopped waiting. He remained with the people who had fought beside him and dedicated his life to protecting them. Then the forest trembled. Every elven seer turned toward the horizon. The warp was changing. A distant scream echoed through the trees. Imperial psychers immediately felt it. The air became heavy, the forest darkened and unnatural shadows moved between the branches. Demons began appearing along the elven borders. The negotiations ended instantly. Imperial soldiers deployed beside the elven warriors. The first demon attack struck before the defensive line was complete. Bolter fire tore through the creatures while elven spells burned them from existence. Yet the combination of Imperial psychic power and elven magic produced an effect neither side expected. Their abilities interacted with the warp in unpredictable ways, sometimes strengthening one another and sometimes creating violent bursts of energy. The battle intensified. Then the sky opened. A massive warp rift formed above the forest, spreading across the clouds like a wound in reality. Demons gathered around its edges as the elven mages struggled to contain it. One of the seers stared into the rift and suddenly went pale. "This is not the source." The Imperial commander looked at her. "What do you mean?" The seer pointed downward. "It is coming from beneath us." The Imperials understood. The storm surrounding the planet had never been merely a barrier. Something beneath the world was connected to it. The elves finally revealed the location of the oldest battlefield associated with Sigmar. If the Imperium wanted to understand what had happened 10,000 years ago, they would have to go there. Because that was where Sigmar had fought the greatest battle of his life. And where, according to the oldest elven memory, he had discovered what was sleeping beneath the world. The road to the Dwarfen kingdoms led the Imperial expedition into a landscape of mountains, glaciers and deep valleys where enormous fortresses had been carved directly into the stone. The dwarfs had watched the Imperial advance from their walls long before the first delegation reached the gates. Unlike the humans of the Empire, they showed little interest in the wonders of the Imperium. They saw armored giants, strange machines, and weapons capable of destroying monsters, but their first instinct was not awe. It was suspicion. The gates closed before the Imperial column. The Dwarfen king refused the Imperium's request for entry and accused the expedition of being another conquering empire. The Imperial commander attempted to explain that the Imperium represented humanity itself, but the dwarfs simply answered that every empire claimed the same thing when it arrived at someone else's doorstep with soldiers. The situation might have ended there if the Imperial scanners had not detected something beneath the mountain. The readings revealed enormous underground structures extending far beyond the visible fortress. Some appeared to be tunnels. Others were massive chambers buried hundreds of meters below the surface. The tech priests immediately demanded access. The dwarfs refused. For several hours, negotiations became increasingly hostile. The Mechanicus representatives were fascinated by the possibility of technology that had survived beneath the mountain for thousands of years. The dwarfs, however, had no intention of allowing outsiders to examine their oldest machines. Then a dwarfen elder mentioned chaos. The Imperials understood immediately. Whatever their differences, both civilizations had spent millennia fighting the servants of the ruinous powers. The dwarfs knew what chaos was. They knew what it did to civilizations, and they knew that the strange disturbances spreading across the world were becoming more dangerous. A temporary alliance was formed. The Imperial tech priests were allowed inside. What they found nearly caused them to forget the war entirely. Deep beneath the mountain stood enormous machines constructed from metals and mechanisms that should not have existed in a civilization considered technologically primitive. Their designs were crude compared with modern Imperial standards, but several principles were unmistakably similar. Energy systems, automated mechanisms and ancient weapons suggested that the dwarfs had preserved technological knowledge from an era far older than their current civilization. The Mechanicus representatives became obsessed. They demanded schematics. The dwarfen engineers laughed at them. One tech priest declared that the machines were part of humanity's technological inheritance and should be surrendered for study. The dwarf engineer replied that the Imperium could have the mountains when the mountains decided to leave. Weapons were nearly drawn. Then the floor exploded. A section of the fortress collapsed as something burst upward from beneath it. Thousands of creatures poured through the opening, carrying crude weapons and screaming in a language that sounded almost like a parody of human speech. The Skaven had arrived. The dwarfs reacted instantly. The ancient hatred between the two races was older than many human kingdoms. Dwarfen warriors formed defensive lines while the Imperial soldiers deployed beside them. Space Marines advanced into the tunnels, bolters roaring as waves of Skaven charged through the darkness. The creatures were numerous enough to overwhelm ordinary defenders, but they had never encountered warriors like the Astartes. Bolter shells tore through the Skaven ranks. Dwarfen axes and hammers finished those who survived. Above them, Dwarfen artillery opened fire. The mountain shook. Entire sections of the underground network collapsed beneath the bombardment, burying hundreds of Skaven and cutting their assault into isolated pockets. The surviving creatures fled into deeper tunnels, screeching warnings about the metal giants who had arrived from the sky. The battle ended, but the dwarfs were no longer willing to hide what they knew. Their elders gathered the Imperial delegation inside one of the oldest chambers beneath the fortress. There they revealed records that had been protected for generations. The documents were older than the Empire of Man and described a warrior who had once entered the mountain alone. Sigmar. He had come searching for something. The Dwarfen records did not say exactly what he had been looking for, only that he believed something ancient was buried beneath the world. He had questioned the Dwarfen kings, explored chambers that had been forgotten even by their own engineers and eventually reached the deepest foundations of the mountain. Then he had sealed a chamber. The dwarfs had obeyed his command for thousands of years. Until now. With the Imperials present, the elders finally led them to the sealed door. It opened only after several ancient mechanisms were activated. Inside was a single object. Armor. It was larger than any suit designed for an ordinary human and far more advanced than anything the dwarfs had ever produced. Its materials had survived countless centuries without significant decay, and its construction contained principles that immediately caught the attention of the Mechanicus. Imperial analysis was completed within minutes. The conclusion was almost identical to the discovery made in the Sigmarite monastery. The armor had been built for something far beyond an ordinary human. Its craftsmanship was consistent with Primarch-level technology. The Imperial commander looked toward the Dwarfen king. "How long has this been here?" The dwarf's expression hardened. "Since Sigmar sealed the chamber." The commander looked back at the ancient armor. "Why did he seal it?" The Dwarfen elder answered quietly. "Because he said the thing beneath the mountain must never be allowed to wake." Far below them, something moved in the darkness. And the old seal began to crack. The Skaven did not retreat from the arrival of the Imperium. They simply disappeared. For several days after the battle beneath the Dwarfen fortress, Imperial sentries reported movement around the camps. Ammunition disappeared. Equipment was found damaged. Soldiers vanished during the night without leaving a trace. The dwarfs blamed the Skaven immediately, but the Imperial commanders initially suspected sabotage by Chaos. It was only when a group of servoskulls detected unusual movement beneath the camp that the truth became impossible to ignore. There were tunnels everywhere. The Imperial expedition descended beneath the mountains and discovered a world that had remained hidden from the surface civilizations for thousands of years. Vast warrens stretched through the darkness, connecting enormous chambers filled with machinery, laboratories, and fortified settlements. Millions of Skaven lived beneath the surface, their civilization expanding through tunnels that reached far beyond the Dwarfen kingdoms. The creatures were not simply scavengers. They were engineers. And they were experimenting with the warp. The Imperial tech priests observed crude reactors, weapons, and machines powered by unstable warp energy. The technology was dangerous and frequently malfunctioned, but its existence explained why the Skaven had survived for so long. They possessed their own form of science, driven by a mixture of genius, madness, and complete disregard for safety. The Skaven themselves had already noticed the Imperium. Their grey seers sensed something unusual about the newcomers. They could feel enormous concentrations of psychic and technological power moving through the tunnels above them. To the Skaven, the Space Marines were not simply soldiers. They were metal humans. The Skaven clans argued over what to do. Some demanded immediate war. Others believed the newcomers could be manipulated. One clan sent an emissary to negotiate, hoping to convince the Imperials that another Skaven clan was responsible for the attacks. The meeting lasted less than a minute before the Imperials realized they were being deceived. Another clan chose a different strategy. They attempted to assassinate the expedition commander. The assassin reached the command chamber but never reached its target. A space marine caught the creature before it could strike and held it suspended in one hand while the Skaven struggled uselessly. The attempt ended diplomacy. The Imperium launched a subterranean assault. Astartes entered the warrens while Imperial Guard units secured the tunnels behind them. The fighting became brutal almost immediately. Skaven poured through side passages in enormous numbers, attacking from darkness and retreating through tunnels too small for the Imperial vehicles to follow. The Space Marines advanced deeper into the underground civilization, destroying weapons factories and warp laboratories as they went. Then they discovered the murals. The oldest chamber contained paintings covering the walls from floor to ceiling. Sigmar. He appeared again and again, fighting beneath the earth against creatures that looked nothing like the Skaven. Some images showed him standing before an enormous gateway. Others depicted him battling armies beneath the surface while strange symbols surrounded him. The Skaven had preserved history that the humans and elves had forgotten. Imperial scholars began translating their records. The story was familiar. Sigmar had entered the depths of the world thousands of years ago. He had fought something ancient and powerful, then constructed a massive seal to prevent it from reaching the surface. But the Skaven leaders understood something the Imperials had not. The seal was weakening. And they believed they could use whatever was trapped behind it. The Grey Seers ordered their engineers to activate the greatest machine in the Skaven fortress. It was enormous, built around a core of concentrated warp energy and connected to the tunnels beneath the planet. The machine began to scream as its mechanisms activated. Imperial psychers collapsed. Their minds were flooded with visions. They saw Sigmar standing beneath the earth. They saw armies of monsters surrounding him. They saw the golden light of the Emperor's arrival. They saw Sigmar fighting alone. And finally, they saw him standing before something enormous that existed beyond the limits of human understanding. The vision ended with Sigmar sealing it away. The warp machine continued to increase its power. Across the planet, the anomalies surrounding the world began to destabilize. Imperial commanders realized the Skaven were not merely experimenting with dangerous technology. They were breaking the ancient seal. Dwarfen engineers were brought into the operation alongside the Mechanicus. Neither side trusted the other, but both understood what would happen if the machine remained active. They fought their way into the central chamber while Space Marines held back the Skaven defenders. The final assault destroyed the machine. The explosion tore through the underground fortress. Tunnels collapsed. Skaven fled in every direction as entire sections of their kingdom disappeared beneath the mountain. Imperial and Dwarfen forces barely escaped before the chamber collapsed behind them. For a moment, it seemed the catastrophe had been prevented. Then the Imperial psychers felt it. The ancient seal had cracked. Not broken. Not yet. But something had noticed the damage. Far beneath the ruined Skaven kingdom, beyond the deepest tunnels and older than any civilization on the surface, a sound moved through the darkness. It was not a voice. It was the first breath of something that had been sleeping for 10,000 years. And now it was awake. The consequences of the broken seal were felt across the world before anyone understood what had happened beneath the Skaven tunnels. Imperial psychers began reporting disturbances that seemed to have no single source. The warp was becoming restless, but this time there was something different within it. It was colder, heavier, almost silent. Then the dead began disappearing. Battlefields that had been fought over for generations suddenly became empty. Bodies vanished from mass graves. Soldiers who had fallen only hours earlier were nowhere to be found. At first, Imperial commanders suspected Skaven activity or chaos cults. Then ancient tombs began opening across the countryside. The first undead army emerged before dawn. Thousands of corpses climbed from burial grounds and marched toward the nearest settlements. They wore armor belonging to warriors who had died centuries earlier. Some carried weapons that had not been used since forgotten wars. Others were little more than skeletons held together by dark magic. Imperial forces responded immediately. They had fought the undead before, but the scale of the attack was unfamiliar. The local priests were the first to identify the symbol appearing on banners carried by the dead. Nagash. The name meant little to the Imperials, but the reaction among the locals was immediate. The priests spoke of an ancient necromancer who had sought dominion over death itself. To the Imperium, the phenomenon looked like another manifestation of warp corruption. Then the Psykers detected something far worse. A consciousness. It was ancient, powerful, and entirely different from the chaotic entities they knew. It did not feel like a demon. It felt like an intelligence that had existed before many of the civilizations on the planet had been born. Nagash had awakened. And he had noticed the Imperium. Through the disturbances in the warp, he sensed something he had not encountered for thousands of years. The genetic presence of the Emperor had returned to his world. Then he understood what it meant. Sigmar's bloodline had returned. Nagash's interest became obsession. His armies began moving toward every location where Imperial forces had been detected. The dead rose in greater numbers, and among them were the bodies of Imperial soldiers killed during the fighting against the Skaven and Chaos cultists. The sight of former comrades marching beneath banners of death unsettled even veteran guardsmen. Imperial commanders ordered them destroyed. The battles became brutal. Imperial artillery reduced entire formations of undead to fragments, but the victory lasted only moments. Necromantic energy pulled bones and armor back together, rebuilding the fallen and sending them toward the Imperial lines again. The Space Marines were forced to fight the dead face to face. Some had once fought beside the very soldiers they now destroyed. The elves eventually revealed that Nagash's power could be disrupted. Their seers knew ancient methods for weakening the magical currents that animated the undead, while the dwarfs brought weapons from their deepest vaults, machines designed during forgotten wars against necromantic armies. For the first time, the Imperials, elves, and dwarfs fought as one army. The combined assault pushed Nagash's forces backward. The undead army broke across several fronts, and Imperial commanders believed they had finally found a way to contain the threat. Then Nagash appeared. He did not arrive with an army. He simply walked onto the battlefield. The dead stopped fighting. Even the Imperial Psykers fell silent. Nagash looked toward the Imperial forces and ignored the soldiers, the Space Marines, and the weapons surrounding him. His attention settled on the Imperial commander. Then he spoke a single name. Sigmar. The commander stepped forward. You know him? Nagash's expression barely changed. I knew him. The words carried more weight than any threat. The Imperial officers demanded answers. Who was Sigmar? How long had Nagash known him? What had happened to the Primarch after the Emperor disappeared? Nagash offered nothing. Instead, he looked toward the horizon as though remembering an age long gone. The son who chose the dead world. The commander demanded that he explain. Nagash simply turned away. You seek the forgotten son. His voice became almost a whisper. Then go where his father first abandoned him. The undead king disappeared into the darkness before the Imperial forces could stop him. The battlefield remained silent. The Imperials had spent days searching ancient records for answers about Sigmar. Now an enemy who claimed to have known him personally had given them a direction. Not a location. A memory. The place where the Emperor had first abandoned his son. And suddenly, the ancient storm surrounding the planet no longer seemed like a barrier hiding the world from the Imperium. It seemed like a scar left behind by the first time the Emperor had tried to take Sigmar away. The words of Nagash did not remain confined to the battlefield. While Imperial commanders debated what he had meant, the world around them began to unravel. Chaos cults that had survived for generations suddenly emerged from hiding, as though some invisible command had been given. In the cities, priests were murdered in their own temples. Noble families were found performing forbidden rituals behind locked doors. Military settlements were attacked from within, and remote villages disappeared beneath clouds of unnatural smoke. The Imperium responded with the only method it trusted when corruption spread without explanation. The Inquisition began investigating everything. Imperial inquisitors arrived in the largest cities and began interrogating nobles, priests, soldiers, and scholars. They were soon joined by local witch hunters who already possessed generations of experience dealing with cults and forbidden magic. The two groups distrusted one another almost immediately, but their investigations uncovered the same disturbing pattern. The cults were different. Their gods were not. Khorne's followers appeared first in military settlements, slaughtering soldiers and civilians in brutal rituals dedicated to blood and war. In the countryside, Nurgle's servants spread sickness through entire communities, leaving behind bodies covered in unnatural corruption. Within the courts of the Empire, Slaanish cultists manipulated nobles through promises of pleasure, power, and excess. Tsench was harder to identify. His followers rarely revealed themselves until their plans were already underway, manipulating officers, spreading false information and turning Imperial commanders against one another. The Inquisition recognized the pattern. 4 powers. 4 ancient entities. 1 enemy. For the people of the Empire, the revelation was terrifying. Their darkest legends were not metaphors. The gods worshipped by their enemies actually existed. Imperial priests attempted to explain the truth, teaching that these beings were manifestations of the warp and that worshipping them only strengthened their influence. The Sigmarite clergy rejected the explanation. To them, chaos was real, but the Imperials' understanding of it was incomplete. They had fought these forces for generations without needing the teachings of Terra. The argument became more than religious. It became political. Chaos exploited the division immediately. Rumors spread through the cities that the Imperium had brought the corruption with it. Others claimed the opposite, that the Empire had hidden chaos cults for centuries and had allowed them to grow unchecked. Every accusation created another. Every death strengthened the hatred between the two human civilizations. Then the northern armies began moving. Across the distant wastes, enormous chaos forces gathered beneath corrupted banners. Their numbers grew with every passing day, drawing warriors, mutants and demons toward a single region of the planet. Imperial augurs detected the movement from orbit and immediately began preparing for war. Then the first warp breach opened. The sky split apart. Demons poured into the material world. Imperial Guard regiments deployed across the northern frontier while Space Marines were sent directly toward the largest concentrations of enemy forces. The fighting was unlike anything most Imperial soldiers had experienced. Greater demons tore through armored formations, their bodies shrugging off weapons that would have destroyed ordinary creatures. The Astartes met them head-on. Bolters thundered through the battlefield while Imperial artillery hammered the chaos lines. The Empire mobilized its own armies, sending cavalry, infantry, and artillery northward. Elven seers joined the defense and managed to close one of the largest warp portals, sacrificing several of their own mages in the process. Dwarfen artillery destroyed another breach before it could fully stabilize. For a brief moment, the 4 civilizations fought as one. But chaos had another objective. Its champions were not simply attacking cities. They were searching for Sigmar. An Imperial strike force eventually captured one of the cultists alive. Under interrogation, the prisoner revealed something that immediately changed the situation. Chaos did not want Sigmar dead. They wanted him alive. The cultists spoke of the lost son of the Emperor as though his existence were a prize capable of changing the balance of the entire war. He claimed that the Chaos Gods had been searching for Sigmar for thousands of years, waiting for the moment when the ancient prison surrounding the world began to weaken. The information did not remain secret for long. Soon the Empire learned the truth about the Golden Warrior. The Emperor had come to their world. He had met Sigmar. He had taken him for his son. And then he had left. The revelation spread through the cities faster than any imperial proclamation could stop it. Sigmarite priests preached that their god had been betrayed by his own father. Imperial officials insisted that the Emperor's disappearance had been caused by the warp anomaly, but the distinction meant little to those who had worshipped Sigmar for generations. The priests accused the Imperium of abandoning their god. The Imperials argued that they had only rediscovered a world lost to history. Neither side could prove the other wrong. Across the Empire, people began asking the same question. If the Emperor had truly come for Sigmar, why had he left him behind? And if Sigmar was truly his son, why had he chosen to remain? The question spread from temples to taverns, from noble courts to military camps, until even imperial soldiers began hearing it whispered among the local population. Did the Emperor abandon Sigmar? Or did Sigmar abandon the Emperor? While humanity argued over the answer, the northern armies of chaos continued their advance. And somewhere beyond the battlefield, something ancient listened to every word. The war had become impossible to miss. Across the planet, armies were moving toward the northern front, and every major power was preparing for a conflict larger than anything the world had seen in centuries. The news eventually reached the orc tribes scattered across the wilderness. At first, the stories were treated as another excuse for war. Then the orcs heard about the giants. Armored humans. Warriors who could walk through gunfire. Soldiers who carried weapons that exploded with thunder. Space Marines. For the orc warbosses, the stories were irresistible. They wanted to fight them. Within days, enormous hordes began gathering. War bands that had spent years fighting one another suddenly found a common destination. The orcs marched toward imperial territory with crude machines, enormous beasts and weapons that looked as though they had been assembled from whatever their warriors could find. Imperial commanders identified the approaching armies as a major Xenos threat. They established defensive lines and prepared artillery positions. The first attack broke through before the Imperial officers understood the scale of the horde. Orcs crashed into the defenses in numbers that seemed impossible. Imperial weapons cut down hundreds, but thousands more continued forward. Defensive positions collapsed under the pressure, and several Imperial units were forced to retreat. Then the Space Marines arrived. The reaction from the orcs was immediate. They cheered. Some began laughing. Others beat their weapons against their armor. The sight of the Astartes had transformed an ordinary invasion into something much more important. A proper fight. The battlefield erupted. Space Marines charged directly into the green tide while Imperial artillery hammered the rear of the orc army. The orcs answered with a storm of bullets, explosives and wildly unpredictable machinery. Some of their weapons malfunctioned spectacularly. Others performed far beyond anything their crude construction should have allowed. The Imperials quickly realized that fighting the orcs was unlike fighting any other enemy. There was no reliable pattern. There was only violence. Then chaos arrived. Demonic forces struck both armies from the flank, expecting to destroy them while they were occupied with one another. Instead, the orcs reacted with fury. The Chaos Warriors had interrupted their fight. That was unacceptable. The orcs turned on them. The sudden change gave the Imperials an opportunity. Imperial artillery shifted fire toward the Chaos positions while Space Marines pushed through the confused battlefield. For several hours, Imperials and orcs fought on the same side, not because they had become allies, but because both wanted the Chaos forces destroyed first. At the center of the battle, an orc warboss eventually found what he had been looking for. A space marine champion. The orc raised his enormous weapon and challenged him before both armies. The marine accepted. Their duel became the center of the battlefield. The warboss fought with brutal strength, swinging a massive axe that could have crushed an ordinary human in a single blow. The space marine fought with discipline and precision, using his superior speed to evade the attacks and strike at openings in the orc's armor. Neither gave ground easily. The duel lasted long enough for warriors on both sides to stop fighting and watch. When it finally ended, the result became a legend before the bodies had even been removed. The temporary understanding between the armies lasted only until the Chaos forces were destroyed. Then the orcs remembered that they still wanted to fight the humans. The battlefield erupted again. Imperial forces withdrew toward their defensive lines while the orcs continued their advance. Yet something unusual had happened among the green ranks. An ancient orc shaman had stopped fighting. He was staring toward the distant mountains. His eyes widened. "The biggest Humi is coming." The other orcs laughed. The shaman did not. He claimed he could feel something approaching through the world, something far larger than any human warrior he had ever sensed. He called the figure Sigmar. The Imperial Psychers dismissed the claim as primitive superstition. But the orcs did not. They changed direction. Instead of attacking the nearest Imperial position, the great hordes began marching toward the ancient battlefield associated with Sigmar. Imperial scouts watched the movement and quickly realized what was happening. The orcs were not the only ones heading there. Chaos armies were converging from the north. Nagasha's forces were moving from the south. Skaven were emerging from beneath the mountains. Elven armies were mobilizing. Dwarfen forces were preparing their ancient weapons. The Empire was gathering everything it could. And the Imperium was doing the same. Every road, army, and ancient prophecy now pointed toward one place. Sigmar's oldest battlefield. The world had spent 10,000 years preserving the memory of one forgotten warrior. Now every power on the planet was coming to find him. The coming war would not be fought for territory. It would be fought for Sigmar. And beneath the ancient battlefield, something was already waiting. The ancient battlefield had become the center of the gathering storm, but the Imperial historians were following a different trail. The oldest records had pointed them toward a fortress hidden deep within the ruins of an ancient kingdom, a place that Sigmar had supposedly used during the earliest years of his reign. From the outside, it looked like another medieval stronghold, its enormous stone walls covered with weathered statues and carvings of the legendary king. Yet Imperial scanners detected something beneath it that did not belong to the world above. There was technology buried beneath the fortress. The expedition broke through several layers of stone before discovering a sealed chamber constructed from materials the local civilization could never have produced. There were no visible doors, locks or controls. Then an Imperial geneticist brought forward a sample containing Primarch genetic material. The reaction was immediate. Symbols appeared across the walls, ancient mechanisms began turning, and the sealed entrance slowly opened. Inside, machinery awakened after thousands of years of silence. A projector activated at the center of the chamber, filling the darkness with a golden image. The figure that appeared needed no introduction. Every Imperial officer recognized him. The Emperor. His recorded voice echoed through the chamber, speaking to someone who had been dead to Imperial history for 10,000 years. "My son." The words confirmed the truth beyond any remaining doubt. Sigmar had been one of the Emperor's lost sons. The Emperor had recognized his genetic identity during their first encounter, just as the Imperial expedition had now discovered. But the recording revealed that the decision to leave Sigmar behind had not been as simple as the legend suggested. The warp anomaly had trapped the planet in a region of unstable reality. It was not merely difficult to cross. It actively interfered with Imperial navigation and communication, twisting the warp around the world and destroying vessels that attempted to penetrate it. At the same time, the Emperor had sensed the presence of chaos beginning to influence the planet. He feared what would happen if Sigmar's identity became known. If the ruinous powers discovered that a lost Primarch lived beyond the anomaly, they would come for him. The planet would become a battlefield before Sigmar had even learned what he truly was. The Emperor therefore ordered his son's identity erased from Imperial records. He intended to return when the anomaly could be safely penetrated. He promised that he would come back. The recording continued, and the Imperial officers slowly realized that the promise had not been forgotten. The Emperor had tried. Several times, Imperial fleets had entered the anomaly searching for the world. Some were destroyed. Others became trapped in regions where time and space behaved unpredictably. Navigators reported impossible visions before losing contact. Each attempt ended in failure. The Emperor could not reach his son. For the first time, the recording revealed something rarely associated with the master of mankind. Fear. Not fear for himself, but fear of what might happen to Sigmar. The Emperor had worried that his son would eventually believe he had been abandoned. He had feared that thousands of years of isolation and constant war would leave Sigmar vulnerable to chaos. Then came the confession. I should have told him the truth. The chamber fell silent. The Emperor admitted that hiding Sigmar's identity had been a mistake. He should have explained who he was. He should have told him why the fleet had withdrawn and why he could not immediately return. Instead, Sigmar had been left with nothing but the memory of a golden father who disappeared into the storm. The final part of the recording revealed what happened afterward. Sigmar eventually stopped waiting. He disappeared into the northern wastes, leaving behind the civilization he had built and the people who had transformed his name into legend. Nobody knew exactly where he had gone. The Emperor's recording ended before revealing whether he had ever been found. The image vanished. For several seconds, the chamber remained completely still. The Imperium had entered this world searching for a lost colony. Now it had discovered something far more dangerous. A living Primarch. And the Emperor himself had admitted that he had failed to bring his son home. Then the ancient machinery began operating again. A transmission escaped the fortress and entered the unstable warp surrounding the planet. The Imperials tried to shut it down, but the signal had already spread beyond their control. Chaos heard it. So did the other powers gathering across the world. The secret was no longer theirs to protect. Sigmar was alive. Somewhere beyond the northern wastes, the forgotten son of the Emperor was waiting. And now every army on the planet knew where to begin looking. The war began before anyone was ready. Chaos armies crossed the northern frontier beneath banners that could be seen from miles away, their ranks filled with warriors, mutants and demonic creatures. From the south came something just as terrible. Ancient tombs opened across the countryside, and Nagash's dead marched toward the living. Beneath the ground, Skaven forces poured from their tunnels, striking settlements and military positions without warning. Then the orcs arrived. The green hordes descended upon the battlefield with the same enthusiasm they had shown since the first Imperial ships appeared. They attacked whatever stood in front of them, including chaos, undead, Skaven and Imperial forces. The ancient world had become a battlefield where every faction had its own enemy and every army seemed determined to fight everyone else. The dwarfs sealed the gates of their mountain fortresses. They knew that if the war reached the deepest halls, centuries of civilization could be destroyed in a single night. The elves mobilized their armies and began moving toward the most threatened regions, while the Empire declared total war. Every soldier was called. Every fortress prepared. Every road became a military route. The Imperium responded with overwhelming force. Imperial Guard regiments established defensive lines across the northern plains while Space Marines deployed to the most dangerous fronts. Then the sky changed. Massive Imperial vessels descended through the clouds, and Titans were deployed onto the battlefield. Their enormous weapons shook the ground as they advanced toward the Chaos armies. Imperial aircraft dominated the skies. For the first time, the people of the Old World witnessed machines capable of flying faster than anything their greatest wizards could imagine. Local scholars watched the Imperial weapons with a mixture of fear and fascination. Wizards began studying the technology, trying to understand how machines could produce effects that resembled the most powerful forms of magic. The Mechanicus had their own obsession. Using dwarfen engineering knowledge, tech priests began restoring ancient machines buried beneath the mountains. Engines that had been silent for centuries roared back to life, adding another layer of firepower to the growing coalition. Then Chaos launched its main offensive. The northern horizon disappeared beneath an advancing army. Imperial artillery opened fire, followed by massed loss guns and the thunder of Astartes' weapons. For a time, the line held. Then the demons reached the defenses. Imperial positions began collapsing. One section of the battlefield was saved when the elves unleashed their magic against a massive demon host. Brilliant energy tore through the creatures, forcing the survivors back into the warp. On another front, dwarfen artillery opened fire from the mountains and annihilated an entire Chaos siege army before it could reach the Imperial defenses. Then the orcs struck. Thousands of greenskins crashed into the Chaos flank, turning the carefully organized assault into chaos of a different kind. Chaos warriors were forced to fight in two directions while Imperial commanders reorganized their lines. The advantage lasted only minutes. Skaven erupted from beneath the battlefield and attacked everyone. Imperial soldiers, Chaos warriors and orcs suddenly found themselves fighting enemies coming from below. The Skaven cared nothing for alliances or territory. They wanted destruction, loot and whatever strange technology they could steal. Then the dead began rising. Nagash had arrived. Corpses from the battlefield stood again, still wearing the armor they had died in. Imperial soldiers found themselves fighting fallen comrades. Orcs fought dead orcs. Chaos warriors were dragged back into the battle by necromantic power. The entire continent became a single war zone. Cities burned. Forests disappeared beneath artillery fire. Ancient fortresses were surrounded by armies. The warp itself seemed to grow thinner with every passing day. From orbit, Imperial commanders began considering the final option: orbital bombardment. The calculations were simple. If the Imperium destroyed the largest concentrations of enemy forces, the war could potentially be ended before the planet became completely consumed. But the Empire refused to surrender its world. Its rulers understood what the Imperium had begun to understand as well. This was no longer a simple conquest. The planet could not be pacified by destroying its armies. Every mountain, forest and ruined city contained another civilization, another ancient enemy, another secret connected to Sigmar. Even if the Imperium defeated every major faction, the warp anomaly would remain. The Imperial commanders finally faced an uncomfortable truth. They could conquer the old world. But they could not control it. And destroying it would mean destroying the very world they had come to understand. Then the Auspex systems detected something. A signal. It came from beyond the northern wastes. The Imperial officers gathered around the display as the transmission repeated. It was weak, ancient and buried beneath layers of interference, but the source was unmistakable. The same signal appeared on elven instruments. Dwarfen machines detected it. Even the Skaven sensed something beneath the storm. The armies stopped moving for a moment. Somewhere beyond the northern wastes, someone had answered. The signal carried only a few words. Sigmar is alive. The signal led the Imperial expedition farther north than any living human had traveled in generations. The landscape became harsher with every kilometer. Forests disappeared beneath fields of ice, mountains rose from the horizon like enormous walls, and the warp storm above the region became so dense that even the fleet in orbit struggled to maintain contact with the ground forces. The transmission continued. Weak. Intermittent. But unmistakably deliberate. The Imperials followed it until their vehicles reached a vast frozen valley. There, beneath layers of snow and ice, their scanners detected artificial structures. The expedition began excavating, and what emerged from the frozen ground changed everything they thought they knew about Sigmar. The ruins were ancient. Beneath the stone were metal corridors, power conduits, and sealed weapons that belonged to an age far older than the Empire of Man. Imperial tech priests immediately recognized several symbols carved into the walls. They were markings from the Great Crusade. The Imperium had been here before. The discovery created an uneasy silence among the expedition. The Emperor had not merely visited Sigmar's world. At some point during the ancient conflict, Imperial forces had reached the northern wastes and constructed or used this facility. The deeper they went, the more evidence they found. Ancient weapons rested inside storage chambers. Some were damaged beyond repair, while others remained perfectly preserved. There were fragments of armor, broken equipment, and records describing battles that had never appeared in Imperial archives. Eventually, the expedition reached a massive underground chamber. The walls were covered with carvings depicting Sigmar. But these were not religious images. There were no crowns, temples, or divine symbols. The carvings showed Sigmar as a warrior. A protector. A man preparing for something that had not yet happened. At the center of the chamber stood a large armored figure covered in dust. The Imperial soldiers initially thought it was a statue. Then the tech priests examined it. It was armor. Sigmar's armor. The suit was enormous, far larger than anything designed for an ordinary human. Its construction immediately reminded the Imperial specialists of early Primarch war gear. The materials, proportions, and engineering were unmistakable. One of the tech priests whispered that the armor had been designed for a son of the Emperor. Before anyone could investigate further, the chamber came alive. Ancient machinery activated along the walls. Lights appeared one after another. A projector rose from the floor. Then a figure appeared. Sigmar. The recording showed him wearing the same armor that stood behind the projector. He looked older than the warrior remembered in the ancient paintings, but his face remained unmistakably human. There was no crown upon his head and no sign that he considered himself divine. He had recorded the message for whoever eventually found the chamber. Sigmar began by revealing the truth he had spent much of his life discovering. He had eventually learned who the Golden Warrior really was. The Emperor was his father. For centuries, Sigmar had searched for answers about the mysterious stranger who had arrived during his youth. He had found fragments of Imperial technology, ancient records, and memories preserved by civilizations that had known the truth. Eventually, he understood what his blood meant. He was not merely a powerful human. He was a Primarch. But learning the truth had not convinced him to seek the Imperium. It had done the opposite. Sigmar explained that he had studied his father's vision of humanity. The Emperor wanted to unite mankind beneath one authority and build an empire capable of surviving the horrors of the galaxy. Sigmar understood the reasoning. But he rejected the conclusion. He had watched ordinary people live and die while rulers argued over kingdoms. He had fought beside farmers, soldiers, kings, and craftsmen. He had seen them rebuild after wars that should have destroyed them. Humanity did not need another distant god. It needed someone willing to protect it. So Sigmar chose his people. He remained on the world and fought. The years became decades. The decades became centuries. Sigmar fought chaos wherever it appeared. He fought beside elves and dwarfs. He defended human kingdoms. He descended beneath the mountains and entered places that no ordinary warrior could survive. Eventually, his battles led him to the truth beneath the world. The warp anomaly was not simply a natural phenomenon. It was a prison. The entire planet was part of an ancient containment system designed to isolate something buried beneath reality itself. The storm prevented outside forces from reaching the world, but it also prevented whatever slept beneath it from escaping into the galaxy. Sigmar discovered the gateway. He discovered the ancient entity behind it. And he realized that the seal was failing. There was no army large enough to guarantee victory if the prison opened. No kingdom could survive it. No alliance could stop it. So Sigmar made the only choice he believed could save his people. He entered the gateway willingly. His presence became part of the seal. His own existence was bound to the ancient machinery, strengthening the prison from within and preventing the entity from crossing into the material world. The recording continued as the chamber around the Imperials remained completely silent. Sigmar knew that one day the seal might fail. He knew that someone might eventually find this place. And when that happened, he wanted his people to remember something. He did not want worship. He did not want temples filled with statues of himself. He wanted them to remember what he had taught. Protect those who cannot protect themselves. Stand together when darkness comes. Never surrender humanity to chaos. And never allow power to become more important than the people it was meant to protect. Sigmar looked directly into the recording device. If you have found this place, then the seal is failing. The image flickered. The first tremor struck. The entire chamber shook. Ancient machinery screamed as energy surged through the walls. Dust fell from the ceiling, and cracks appeared across the gateway at the center of the chamber. The Imperial Psychers immediately felt something behind it. Something enormous. Something awake. The recording continued for one final moment. Sigmar's expression changed. The storm was never meant to keep you out. Another impact struck the gateway. It was meant to keep it in. The recording vanished. The chamber shook violently. Across the ancient gateway, a single crack opened from top to bottom. Cold warp energy poured through it. The Imperial soldiers raised their weapons. The tech priests began shouting warnings. And somewhere beyond the gateway, something moved. The seal was failing. Sigmar was still inside. And whatever he had spent thousands of years imprisoning was beginning to wake with him. The gateway opened completely. Warp energy flooded the underground chamber with such force that the Imperial soldiers were thrown against the walls. The ancient machinery screamed as power surged through systems that had been silent for thousands of years. Reality itself seemed to distort around the gateway, and the stone floor cracked beneath the pressure. The Imperial Psychers collapsed almost immediately. Some were unconscious. Others remained on their knees, struggling to keep their minds intact as something enormous pressed against the barrier between worlds. None of them could identify what they were sensing. It was not simply a demon, nor was it a normal presence in the warp. It was something far older. The Space Marines formed a defensive perimeter around the chamber. Their weapons were aimed toward the gateway while the Imperial Guard established positions behind them. Nobody knew what would emerge, but every soldier understood that whatever waited beyond that threshold could not be allowed to reach the surface. Then chaos arrived. Demons poured through the outer ruins as Chaos champions led their armies toward the underground chamber. They had followed the warp disturbance from across the northern wastes, and they knew exactly what they were seeking. The lost Primarch. But the Imperials were not alone. Elven mages entered the chamber and immediately began reinforcing the failing containment system. Their magic spread across the ancient machinery, forming layers of energy around the gateway. The interaction between their spells and the warp field was unstable, but it slowed the collapse. Dwarfen engineers followed them. They activated ancient machines recovered from beneath their mountain kingdoms and connected them to the forgotten containment system. Engines older than many human kingdoms roared to life, feeding power into the failing seal. Then Nagash appeared. The undying king entered the ruin surrounded by an army of corpses. His attention was fixed entirely upon the gateway. He had heard Sigmar's name spoken across the world, and he knew that whatever was behind that door could change the balance of power forever. Chaos wanted Sigmar. Nagash wanted Sigmar. The Imperium wanted Sigmar. And now every major faction was converging on the same place. The first clash was catastrophic. Chaos warriors crashed into Imperial positions while demons tore through the outer defenses. Elven spells illuminated the darkness as dwarfen weapons fired into the advancing undead. Orcs descended from the surrounding mountains and attacked anything they could reach. Even the Skaven emerged from hidden tunnels, trying to exploit the confusion. The ancient ruins became a battlefield. Yet through all of it, the gateway continued to shake. Then something changed. The warp energy suddenly stopped. The demons became still. The machinery fell silent. Even the armies outside seemed to pause as the gateway stood completely motionless. A shadow appeared beyond it. At first, the Imperial soldiers could see only a gigantic silhouette surrounded by darkness. Then one enormous foot stepped through the threshold. The figure entered the chamber. Sigmar had returned. He was not the young warrior preserved in the oldest paintings. Thousands of years had passed since the Emperor first encountered him, and every one of those years seemed to have left its mark. His face was older, harder, and covered with the scars of battles that no living historian could remember. Ancient war gear covered his body. His armor was massive, built for a warrior far beyond the proportions of an ordinary human. It carried weapons and markings from civilizations that had disappeared long before the Imperium's arrival. Some pieces appeared imperial in origin, while others had clearly been forged by the people of the Old World. Sigmar had spent thousands of years becoming something neither the Imperium nor the Empire had ever known. A Primarch who belonged entirely to himself. Imperial scanners immediately reacted. Auspex systems began producing contradictory readings. Genetic scanners activated without being ordered to do so, comparing the biological signature of the figure standing before them against ancient classified records. The results appeared. Then disappeared. Then appeared again. The system confirmed the same conclusion. Primarch. Genetic lineage confirmed. The Imperial officers stared at the display. There was no mistake. The lost Primarch was standing before them. For 10,000 years, the Imperium had considered the disappearance of its lost sons a mystery buried somewhere in the distant past. Now one of them had returned, not from another world or another civilization, but from the heart of a forgotten human realm that had survived without the Imperium. The Imperial commander slowly lowered his weapon. Then he knelt. The Space Marines followed. The soldiers behind them lowered their heads as the realization spread through the chamber. Sigmar did not move. His eyes passed over the kneeling warriors until they reached the symbol painted across their armor. The Imperial Aquila. He stared at it for a long moment. The sight carried him backward through thousands of years. He remembered the Golden Fleet. He remembered the warrior who had stood before him when he was young. He remembered being told that his world belonged to something larger than itself. And he remembered watching those ships disappear into the storm. Sigmar looked toward the Imperial commander. His voice was quieter than anyone expected. "Did my father come?" The commander remained kneeling. He had faced demons, Xenos, and armies that could destroy worlds, yet he could not answer a single question. The Emperor was not there. After 10,000 years, the man Sigmar had waited for was still absent. The commander lowered his head. Sigmar understood. His expression revealed neither anger nor forgiveness. Only disappointment. Then the silence ended. A Chaos champion screamed from the entrance as a wave of demons surged into the chamber. Nagash raised his weapon, commanding the dead forward. Orcs roared outside as another army crashed into the ruins. The battlefield erupted again. Imperial bolters opened fire. Elven magic filled the chamber with light. Dwarfen weapons thundered beneath the mountain. Chaos answered with warp fire. Nagash's undead advanced through the destruction. Sigmar watched the armies collide for a single moment. Then he reached for his weapon. The Imperial soldiers stepped aside. Sigmar walked toward the enemy. He had spent thousands of years behind the gateway, fighting alone to keep the darkness imprisoned. Now the darkness had come to his world. And the forgotten son of the Emperor was no longer waiting. He entered the war. Sigmar did not need to give a speech. The moment he stepped onto the battlefield, the armies of the Empire began moving around him. Soldiers who had been retreating moments earlier turned back toward the enemy. Banners rose above the smoke, and commanders who had spent generations defending their kingdoms suddenly found themselves following the warrior who had become the foundation of their civilization. The Space Marines advanced beside him. For the first time, the people of the old world saw Sigmar fighting alongside warriors from the civilization that had once taken him away. The contrast was striking. The Astartes moved with disciplined precision while Sigmar fought with the brutal strength of someone who had spent thousands of years fighting without an army behind him. Behind them, the dwarfs unleashed their greatest weapons. Ancient artillery thundered from the mountains, destroying chaos formations before they could reach the battlefield. Elven mages gathered beneath the ruined towers and began channeling powers that had been preserved since before the Empire existed. Their magic spread across the sky, weakening the warp rifts opening above the battlefield. Then the orcs charged. The greenskins crashed into the chaos lines with enormous enthusiasm, caring nothing for strategy as long as there was something worth fighting. Their attack shattered the enemy's formation and created an opening for the Imperial forces. The Skaven immediately exploited it. They emerged from beneath the battlefield, attacking Chaos warriors from behind while sabotaging Imperial positions at the same time. Their treachery was so predictable that nobody trusted them, yet their attacks still caused enormous damage. Amid the chaos, Nagash approached. The Undying King moved through the battlefield surrounded by dead soldiers and necromantic energy. His presence silenced the creatures around him as his attention settled on Sigmar. The two had met before. Not yesterday. Not decades ago. Centuries ago. Sigmar remembered. There had been battles beneath ruined cities and forgotten kingdoms where the living fought armies that could never truly die. Nagash had been there during some of Sigmar's darkest wars, watching from the shadows as the young Primarch slowly became the warrior his people would one day worship. Now they stood before one another again. Nagash smiled. He told Sigmar that he remembered the first time they fought. He remembered the rage of the young warrior and the determination that had made him different from every human king Nagash had ever encountered. Then he spoke of the Emperor. Nagash told Sigmar that his father had never understood him. The Emperor had seen a weapon. A ruler. A Primarch who could help build an empire. He had never understood the man Sigmar had chosen to become. Sigmar gave no answer. Nagash continued, promising him something the Emperor never had. Freedom. He offered Sigmar an eternity beyond death, a kingdom where no human could betray him and no father could abandon him again. Then the necromancer reached for his soul. The chamber of the warp seemed to open inside Sigmar's mind. He saw the loneliness. The centuries of battle. The moment the Golden Fleet disappeared. The endless years spent fighting while knowing that his father had continued somewhere beyond the storm. Nagash tried to turn those memories into hatred. Sigmar refused. He had lived with those memories for too long to be controlled by them. His soul remained his own. Nagash's expression changed. Sigmar struck. The impact sent necromantic energy across the battlefield, tearing apart the dead surrounding the Undying King. Nagash answered with a wave of magic that shook the ground, and for a moment the two ancient enemies disappeared beneath a storm of power. Around them, the greater battle reached its climax. Imperial titans advanced through the chaos lines, their weapons destroying enormous war machines. Dwarfen artillery reduced undead armies to shattered bones. Elven mages finally sealed one of the largest warp rifts above the battlefield. The orcs smashed into the chaos rear. The entire enemy formation began collapsing. Nagash's armies lost their momentum as the necromantic magic holding them together weakened. Thousands of undead creatures fell across the battlefield, finally becoming nothing more than corpses. Nagash disappeared into the darkness before Sigmar could finish the confrontation. But Sigmar did not pursue him. He had sensed something worse. The anomaly. The ancient containment system beneath the world was failing faster than anyone realized. Sigmar moved toward the center of the ruins while the armies continued fighting around him. The deeper he went, the stronger the warp pressure became. Ancient machinery had begun breaking apart, revealing enormous structures hidden beneath the planet. Then he reached the heart of the system. There, beyond the shattered gateway, Sigmar finally saw what had been imprisoned for thousands of years. Something vast moved within the darkness. It had no true shape that the human mind could understand. It was older than the kingdoms of the old world, older than the Imperium's arrival, and perhaps older than the civilization that had created the containment system itself. Sigmar finally understood why the Emperor had been unable to simply conquer this world. The planet had been a prison. And the Emperor's arrival 10,000 years earlier had not caused the catastrophe. It had delayed it. His intervention had strengthened the containment system long enough for Sigmar to continue fighting. But that borrowed time was ending. The entity struck the inner barrier. The entire world shook. Sigmar watched the ancient seal begin to fracture. There was only one way to stop it. The anomaly had to be closed permanently. And Sigmar knew exactly what that meant. If he sealed the gateway again, the old world would disappear from the Imperium forever. This time, however, he would not be trapped by accident. He would choose to remain. The Imperial fleet began preparing for evacuation before the containment system had even been fully understood. Ships in orbit opened their hangars while commanders ordered every surviving Imperial unit to withdraw toward the extraction zones. The message was clear. Whatever happened next, the Imperium could no longer remain on the planet. Sigmar was given another choice. The Imperial commander approached him with an offer that would have changed the history of mankind. The Imperium could take him beyond the anomaly. He could meet his brothers. He could return to the civilization created by his father and claim his place among the Primarchs. For the first time since his return, Sigmar listened. He learned that some of his brothers were still alive. Others had vanished, fallen, or turned against the Emperor. He heard about the Great Crusade and the worlds conquered in humanity's name. He learned about the Horus heresy and the war that had nearly destroyed the Imperium. Then he learned what came afterward. The Emperor's dream had created unity. It had also created tyranny. Humanity had survived, but the civilization Sigmar heard described was nothing like the future he had once imagined for his people. The Imperium was vast beyond comprehension, yet its citizens lived beneath endless war, fear, and obedience. Sigmar understood why his father had made his choices. But understanding was not the same as agreeing with them. Before he could answer the Imperial commander, another transmission appeared. The ancient recording from the Emperor had been recovered and transmitted toward the battlefield. His voice emerged through the Imperial communications network, reaching Sigmar once again after 10,000 years. The Emperor spoke to his son. He did not ask him to return. He did not command him. He simply asked for forgiveness. The battlefield seemed strangely quiet as Sigmar listened. For thousands of years, he had imagined this moment. He had wondered what he would say if the Emperor ever stood before him again. Now the answer came easily. Sigmar looked toward the Imperial Aquila. "I do not forgive you." The Imperial officers remained silent. "But I do not condemn you either." He paused. "I am no longer the son who waited." Then Sigmar turned away from the fleet. His decision was made. He would remain. The containment system had begun collapsing, and there was no time left. Dwarfen engineers moved into the ancient machinery and began stabilizing the damaged mechanisms. They worked beside Imperial tech priests, repairing systems that neither civilization fully understood. The elves gathered around the gateway. Their magic flowed into the failing seal, reinforcing the ancient barriers while Imperial psychers added their own strength. Some collapsed under the pressure, but others remained until the final stage. Outside the fortress, the war continued. The Empire's armies defended the ruins against the last Chaos assaults. Imperial Guard units held the outer walls while Space Marines fought wherever the fighting was fiercest. Orcs remained engaged with the surviving Chaos armies, apparently delighted that the battle had lasted this long. Even Nagash was forced to withdraw. The Undying King disappeared into the depths of the underworld, taking what remained of his forces with him. Then the final Chaos armies collapsed. The battlefield fell silent. For the first time since the Imperium had entered the Old World, there was no enemy army approaching the fortress. Only the dying anomaly remained. Sigmar stood at the center of the containment system as the ancient gateway began closing around him. The Imperial commander watched from the edge of the chamber. There was still time to leave. The final evacuation ships were waiting. Sigmar could still step aboard. He could leave this world behind and become what the Imperium had always wanted him to be. A Primarch. A son of the Emperor. A weapon for humanity. Instead, he remained where he was. The gateway began collapsing. The Imperial ships launched into the sky as the warp anomaly contracted around the planet. One by one, the vessels disappeared into the storm, carrying the surviving soldiers and the impossible knowledge they had discovered. Sigmar watched them leave. He did not chase them. The last Imperial vessel vanished beyond the clouds. Then the containment system reached its final stage. The gateway closed. The warp storm folded inward. The Old World disappeared from Imperial sensors. For a second time, the Imperium had lost the forgotten son of the Emperor. But this time, Sigmar had not been taken from them. He had chosen to stay. The surviving Imperial fleet escaped the collapsing anomaly and returned to Imperial space. The expedition was immediately classified. Every surviving report was sealed, every record restricted, and the existence of the world was officially declared a loss. Sigmar was never mentioned, and the officers who had witnessed the truth were ordered to remain silent. Centuries passed before a forgotten inquisitorial archive was opened by accident. Most of the data had been corrupted, but one image remained intact. It showed a gigantic warrior standing before thousands of soldiers, surrounded by the symbols of a civilization that officially no longer existed. The Inquisitor examined the genetic identification attached to the image. Primarch, Sigmar. Status, alive. He assumed the record was ancient. Then another signal appeared. It came from beyond the old warp anomaly. The transmission contained only one identifier. Sigmar. The Inquisitor stared at the display as the meaning became impossible to ignore. The anomaly had not vanished. Somewhere beyond Imperial space, the old world might still survive, hidden from the galaxy once again. And somewhere beyond that veil, Sigmar might still be fighting for the people he had chosen. The Imperium had lost its forgotten son twice. But this time, it knew exactly where he was. Sigmar was never truly lost. He chose not to come home.